Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you for coming out in this heat to be up in the attic of the House Museum to listen to some Georgian music. Today I'm going to be talking about the music during Samuel Johnson's time and its part in the forging of a really remarkable forging of national British identity. I will be including some music examples. They'll be about 30 seconds each, so I do apologize if it's a favorite one of yours and it doesn't go on. That's why I'm just warning you. And I'm also apologizing if I omit some of your favorite songs, just in the interest of time. I had to be so careful. All right, Samuel Johnson wrote, "Of all noises, I think music is the least disagreeable." From him, that was a rave. All right, so a little bit of a background. The 17th century in England was horrible. Century horribilis, right? There was the Civil War. There was regicide. There was Puritan rule, no Christmas for 13 years. There was the Great Fire, the Great Plague. But the 18th century, now you had a time of optimism, a time of renewal. Britain was really taking its place on the world stage. You had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution at home and incredible riches coming in from the colonies abroad. This all contributed to London being Europe's largest city by the early 18th century, as well as a major center for shipping, for the Navy, for trade. So with the rise of economic stability, there was also the rise of patriotism, power, and culture. So how did this affect the music at the time? You had a growing merchant class, bankers, traders, lawyers, and they helped to generate a consumer culture, which included a very strong demand for entertainment and cultural events. The merchant class wanted respectability. And like any merchant class anywhere, what better way to strive for that than to imitate the aristocracy? Also by this time, there were approximately 4,000 aristocrats and landed gentry families who had homes in the city. They would be in London during the sitting of Parliament from late autumn, early winter through June. They brought with them their taste for Italian music from their grand tour. So it was no surprise that the most fashionable music forms were all Italian: the sonata, the concerto, and the opera. Johann Mattheson was a German composer and critic from the early 18th century. He wrote, "He who in the present time wants to make a profit out of music betakes himself to England. The Italians exalt music, the French enliven it, the Germans strive after it, and the English pay for it well." So in 1705, Italian opera first arrived in London, and it dominated London's music scene. Mostly it focused on opera seria, as opposed to opera buffa, which is comedy. The seria was, higher dramatic stories from mythology, from classical history, featuring virtuosic singing and elaborate arias for the star performers. So our first example is going to be one of the Italian composers who was living in London, Bononcino, and this is Tigre Piagata from Griselda. All right, example of Italian opera. But the Italians had competition. In 1706, George Frederick Handel traveled to Italy, the center of the opera world. Right away, 21-year-old composer, he had amazing success. While he was in Italy, he met a number of English visitors on their grand tour, and they encouraged him to come to London at some point. In 1710, though, he was appointed Kapellmeister to the Elector of the Court of Hanover. Remember this elector, this is important. Within 6 months of his appointment, though, Handel was given permission to travel to London. He took a long leave of absence. He was actually in London the entire season of 1710 to 1711. He had enormous success with his opera Rinaldo. The staging for Rinaldo was spectacular. You had fire-breathing dragons, live birds released on stage, the best singers in Europe. More is more. All of this cost a lot of money, and it was a financial disaster, but it put Handel on the map, and he became very popular with the elites. We are now going to hear a clip, Furie Terribili from Rinaldo. Here's a story. Okay, terrible fury. So Handel returned to Hanover, but then the autumn of 1712, he was again granted permission to go to London. And this time they said, come on, come back within a reasonable time. They specified that. However, 2 years later, he still did not return. And so it happened, though, that in 1714, remember the Elector of Hanover? Guess what? Crowned King George I of England. Who knew that the 51st in line for the throne would become king? All right. Not too long after George I was crowned, the Jacobites rebelled, tried to overthrow the House of Hanover. They failed. But in spite of that failure, the king was shrewd. He knew, as the 51st in line, and as someone who barely spoke English, he needed credibility and needed to prove the legitimacy of his throne. He was aware that music could be one of the tools, and a very effective tool, to support authority and power. He commissioned Handel to write water music to accompany a royal water party along the River Thames. We'll be hearing a bit of that now. While he's finding this, I can tell you this was the first time that French horns were used in an orchestra in England. And the unique sound was a real success. It was this type of music that expressed British unity and loyalty. Here it is. There are those horns. So, 1718 to 1719, about 60 wealthy gentlemen organized a joint stock company called the Royal Academy, under the patronage of George I, to produce opera to the public. This was London's first Italian opera company, and they engaged Handel as master of the orchestra, and he held that post for the rest of his life. They also engaged two Italian composers, Filippo Amadei and Giovanni Bononcini. We just heard of Bononcini's example. Now, Bononcini had already produced many operas throughout Europe, and there was a real rivalry between Handel and Bononcini. Interestingly, and I don't know why this is, but the Tories favored Handel. The Whig Party favored Bononcini. That's a good research topic. Their competition inspired the epigram by John Byrom in 1725. And this was the first time the phrase Tweedledum and Tweedledee had been set in print, and it made the term famous. Some say, compared to Bononcini, that Mynheer Handel's but a ninny. Others aver that he to Handel is scarcely fit to hold a candle. Strange all this difference should be twixt Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Handel did gain more and more popularity than Bononcini did not. He became a pensioner of the Duchess of Marlborough, but he had to leave London after being caught trying to pass off a madrigal by Antonio Lotti as his own work. So that was the end of him. With the death of King George I in 1727, his son succeeded him as King George II. Handel was commissioned to write an anthem for the coronation, which is where Zadok the priest was first performed. It's been part of every British coronation since. Listen to this massive opening chorus. It's a real illustration of a choral technique that the author Donald Grout calls Handelian hammer strokes. I love that phrase, Handelian hammer strokes. And this happens to be the version from King Charles III coronation. So, back to popular Italian opera. All things changed. The public was growing tired of Italian musicians, and there were many reasons. First of all, Italians were Catholic. They had questionable moral standards. There were also conspiracy theories, even then, with their embedded messages being sung in Italian meant for the Jacobites. With rising nationalism, there was a feeling of cultural betrayal, and this culminated in a real backlash against these foreign operas. More and more people wanted musical theater sung in English. In Britain, there was a long tradition of ballads, which are narrative songs with, really wonderful tunes, real music of the people. These ballads inspired the Beggar's Opera, written in 1728 by John Gay. Now, it basically satirizes Italian opera. There are a few numbers that directly parody familiar operas, but the music, for the most part, consists of popular tunes, ballads. So we're going to hear something now, "Oh, What Pain It Is to Part," and it's sung to a tune from Scotland. That was it.
Oh, what pain it is to part. Can I leave thee? Can I leave thee? Oh, what pain it is to part. Can thy Polly ever leave thee?
And if you notice, listen even to the quality of that voice was different from the earlier soprano that we heard. And obviously we don't have any recordings from that time period, but there would be a difference in the quality of the voice, the type, the timbre of voice. And this would probably be a pretty typical sound. So the Beggar's Opera signaled a general reaction in England against London taste for Italian opera. Now, in Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, he does describe Italian opera an exotic and irrational entertainment. So ballad operas with a new rage. With the public's changing tastes, the Royal Academy began to have financial difficulties. In 1729, when it stopped producing operas, Handel and a partner took over the theater, but there was another competing organization, the Opera of the Nobility, supported by George II's son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. Remember that, because he gets into the mix later on as well. The two organizations completely divided the London public, and by 1737, both companies were nearly bankrupt. So Handel had an idea. Earlier in 1718, he had written Esther, a masque, or chamber drama. So masques really were entertainment at the court, all right? Regular people would never get to see them. There would be singing, there would be dancing, instrumental, there'd be elaborate sets, and it would usually all be to flatter the royal patron. All right, there would, something from mythology or history to show all the wonderful attributes of the royal patron. All right, so he revised Esther in 1732, planned to present it at the Royal Academy, but the Bishop of London, Edmund Gibson, wouldn't permit a drama based on a biblical story to be acted out on the stage. Handel presented Esther in concert form. This was the first English oratorio. This is important. So oratorio, basically, it contains all the forms an opera does. You have You have arias, you have the chorus. Choruses are much more important in oratorios. They're featured a lot more. You have recitative, you have instrumental overtures, no staging, no costumes, no dancing, no sets. And it all began in Italy a century or so before because operas were not allowed to be performed during Lent. And so this would be a way to present something. They were usually about sacred texts, something from the Bible. The new incarnation of Esther was quite popular, but probably because of all his earlier success, Handel was still clinging to the idea that opera could be popular. But facing bankruptcy definitely focuses the mind. When subscriptions to the 38-39 season plummeted, he started to pay more attention to oratorios. In 1739, his oratorio Saul was very well received, and in 1741 he was invited to write Messiah for Dublin, which he wrote in 24 days. And Handel committed himself to the new genre of the oratorio in English. Oratorios were a lot cheaper to produce, right? You didn't have all of those sets, all of those expensive costumes. It was also appealing to a middle-class public that never quite felt comfortable with the highfalutin Italian opera. He triumphed in Dublin, but not immediately in London. Apparently, according to one of the writers at the time, there was strong opposition to hearing the words of the New Testament in a theater peopled by actors and actresses of loose morals and dubious sexual habits. So when Messiah had its London premiere of Covent Gardens, Handel didn't even use the title. He just called it a new sacred oratorio. He could only use Messiah as the title once the Bishop of London passed away. Then he was able to do it. And everything changed. When Handel presented Messiah for the benefit of the London Foundling Hospital, it was a huge success, and Handel presented it annually. 10 years later, in 1759, it was the last piece, in fact, that he conducted 8 days before his death. So his most important innovation in the oratorios was his use of the chorus. He was already steeped in German and Italian choral idioms, but it was the English choral tradition that influenced him most profoundly, and that's what really makes Handel's oratorio so successful. He has a wonderful use of word painting. Now, word painting, it's a technique that goes back to Gregorian chant, you know, that the music would kind of illustrate what the word was saying. Altissimi, most high, you'll be singing in a higher range, all right? De profundis, out of the depths, a little bit lower, all right? So we're going to hear some examples now of word painting in the chorus, All We Like Sheep. It begins, all we like sheep have gone astray. And on astray, the music, stray, you just see them wandering around. We have turned. And there are these twisting figures that never really go anywhere. We have turned, and it just does that. And then everyone to his own way. Repeated notes, all right, showing the stubbornness. And you can just imagine when you listen to this, listen if you can, I hope this comes through. In the bass rhythm of the orchestra, there are these even eighth notes. So you could just imagine all these little woolies just going around and banging into things, banging into each other. All we like sheep have gone astray.
All we like sheep, all we like sheep have gone astray.
Brilliant.
All we like sheep. Oh, we are sheep on the
Listen to the bass. And this next example is one of the most recognizable works in the entire canon of Western music. Everyone knows this.
Oh,
I mean, you can just tell this was a master opera composer. He understood how to express things to an audience. He understood drama. And you can hear it in his oratorios. You know, he's just a master at this. He was really an international composer, and it was a perfect fit. Of all of Europe, London was the city most hospitable to a cosmopolitan style. The British came to regard Handel as a national institution, and with good reason. He became a naturalized British subject in 1726 and wrote all his major works for British audiences. So, in England then also, a very notable English composer in the 18th century was Thomas Arne. He became a leading British theatre composer, working at many venues, including West End's Drury Lane, Covent Gardens, and Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. There are articles that allude to the rivalry between Arne and Handel during the first 20 years of Samuel Johnson's life in London, 1737 to 57. It appears actually that Arne was the constant rival. He was very aware, very jealous of Handel, but Handel was concentrating on his own affairs. He was 25 years older. He was established, so he really wasn't thinking about him too much. In 1740, Arne wrote Alfred, a masque. Remember, I mentioned that before. It was commissioned by Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had set up a kind of oppositional court to his father, George II. He was on very poor terms with his father, and he tried his best to differentiate himself. He wanted to emphasize his own British nationality and identity, as opposed to George II's German nationality. It ended up, after all of this, Frederick predeceased George II, and after George II passed, Frederick's son became George III. Alfred is rarely performed now, but one of its songs had tremendous success, and it's still sung proudly today. What a legacy, right? The song captures the essence of British pride, maritime power, and the spirit of independence. 1745, Charles Edward Stuart led the Jacobite Rising. The song God Save the King was used among those loyal to George II. In 1745, Arne wrote a new setting for the Drury Lane Theatre. He supplied the British with a national anthem. I'm just aware of time. I just want to get everything in. All right, so God Save the King, Rule Britannia were perfect examples of music being used to rally and unite the population during times of instability. Handel was also composing during the revolt. He wrote an occasional oratorio in 1746. Now, this oratorio is based on the poetry of John Milton and Edmund Spenser, not biblical. He called it an oratorio, but it's not really a drama. It doesn't tell a story. This oratorio expressed pure patriotism and national unity. We're going to hear "Millions Unborn Shall Bless the Hand." 18th century London introduced a new way of listening to music, the paying public. It all started in 1672. John Bannister was a struggling musician, and he had a very good idea. For 1 shilling, any member of the general public could enter his home and ask for the music they wanted to hear performed. Soon pubs and taverns started charging for music, devoting upstairs salons to public performances. Assembly rooms became more and more upscale. Strangers from different classes could meet, talk, and socialize together like never before. By the middle of the century, over 100 concert venues were in regular use in London, including Covent Gardens, which opened in 1732. This was a remarkable development. In the past, if you wanted to hear fashionable music, you're out of luck, unless you were royalty or powerful clergy. The concept that regardless of background or class, you could actually choose to listen to music was revolutionary, and it came from Britain. So, now one could hear concerts in theaters, taverns, clubs, and in very new venues, the pleasure gardens. Very popular entertainment in the mid-18th century London. Visitors would stroll around the garden paths, listen to music, have some refreshments, and socialize. The most popular were those at Vauxhall in Kennington, and the more fashionable rival, Ranelagh Gardens, which is now the site of the annual Chelsea Flower Show. Jonathan Tyers was the proprietor of Vauxhall. It had been an area of ill repute when he took it over. And even though he was promoting everything as being family friendly, he still had an eye on profits. So he kept some of the pathways unlit for the benefit of assignations. So the concept of performing high quality music in the open air was quite a novelty. He introduced a much larger audience to serious music than had ever been possible before. An audience could choose to listen or not. They could choose where to listen. They could just be walking around. So it was very, very different, and this really introduced many to the idea of concert as a public entertainment. Samuel Johnson appreciated Vauxhall's blend of entertainment and music and social strolling. In fact, there is a watercolor of his. It was 1784, and it's one of Johnson's visits. An evening at Vauxhall Gardens, he's in a private supper box with Boswell and his friend Goldsmith and a lady friend, and there are also a number of other people there. Now, because of the dates and people passing away and all, it was impossible for them to all be there at the same time, so it's more of a watercolor just providing an image of the type of people who would be going there. So he did praise Vauxhall for, quote, good eating and drinking, and a mixture of curious show. So the programs consisted of all instrumental music, and Handel dominated Vauxhall's repertory, and it boosted the composer's popularity even more. Tyers actually resisted song at Vauxhall for about 12 years, afraid of seeming impropriety, loose morals of singers, and all that. This is the guy who kept the unlit passages, right? All right. But by this time, Vauxhall was being criticized for the absence of song. So Tyers hired Cecilia Young, a soprano who later married Thomas Arne, and songs were introduced. Arne became music director at Vauxhall in 1745, and his ballads were regularly performed at the gardens. His songs were lovely, lighthearted, natural. If any of you have ever taken voice lessons, you've probably sung a few of his pieces because they're so pretty. They fit in perfectly with Tyers' own philosophy of making the arts available to all. So we're going to hear a setting of Shakespeare's Where the Bee Sings.
Where the bee sings, where I come, in a forest where I die, where I go to
So these songs, there was actually something known as the Vauxhall song. They were tuneful, easy on the ear. They also didn't last long. New songs would be constantly written. There was such a demand. So in addition to Arne, Many of the songs performed in the gardens were written by other British composers, Henry Herron, Starling Goodwin, James Hook. Hook wrote over 2,000 songs for pleasure gardens. Most famous was Sweet Lass of Richmond Hill in 1789, which was said to be a favorite of George III.
Richmond Hill, there is a lass more bright than may they go. It's charms all other nature past, the rose will not come for. This lass so neat, with smiles so sweet, has won my right good will. My crowns is high to call thee mine. Sweet lass of Richmond Hill, sweet lass of Richmond Hill, sweet lass of Richmond Hill. My crowns is high to call thee mine. Sweet lass of Richmond Hill.
So to give an idea of the type of crowds that would go to Vauxhall, to celebrate the ending of the 8-year War of Austrian Succession, George II wanted a major celebration. There would be 100 cannons, there would be fireworks, all with music by Handel. George II made it clear that he wanted the sound of martial instruments, informing Handel that he, quote, hoped there would be no fiddles, not a string instrument. So Handel wrote for a massive military band, trumpets, horns, woodwinds. The open-air rehearsal in Vauxhall Gardens attracted a crowd of 12,000 people. Traffic was so heavy it took some carriages 3 hours just to make it across the London Bridge. And there were reports of road rage. Apparently there was fighting and injuries among the footmen of those carriages. But we're going to hear now a little snippet of music for the royal fireworks. So the competition, Ranelagh Gardens, opened about 10 years later. And it was considered a little more fashionable than its older rival. The entrance fee was 2 shillings and 6 instead of 1 shilling. Horace Walpole, a writer and the youngest son of the first British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, wrote soon after the gardens opened, "It has totally beaten Vauxhall. You can't set your foot without treading on a prince or Duke of Cumberland." So it was considered a little more posh. The centerpiece, what made it really special though, was a rotunda that was there, that was heated. There was actually a heating area, fireplace, and chimney, so you could actually hear concerts when it wasn't hot. When it was cold and it was rainy, it was a protected, heated area. This was really big for these pleasure gardens, and so it had that. Mozart, when he came to London when he was 8 years old, he performed there. They did advertise him as being 7 years old because it just made him more amazing, right? To be 7 than 8. All right, so Samuel Johnson, with all this, wasn't paying much attention to classical music or composers. However, there was one composer he was aware of, not a very positive way. Charles Dibdin, born in 1745, was one of the most prolific English singer-songwriters of his time. He wrote over 1,000 songs, as well as 30 dramatic pieces. So Johnson, I'm going to really consolidate this. I'm looking at the time. Okay, so Johnson was high culture, Dibdin was low culture, and more, I shouldn't say low, more popular. All right, but the time, the upper class could kind of look down on something like that. But they did have an intersection at the Shakespeare Jubilee in 1769, this massive 3-day festival. And it was to celebrate William Shakespeare, organized by David Garrick, mutual friend. He was an English actor and playwright who influenced just about every aspect of 18th century theatrical practice. The thing is, he was also a shameless ham and self-promoter. All right, so Johnson, who wrote the preface and who did editing with Shakespeare, he felt very protective about this. And he said the way to honor Shakespeare is with good editing, not with these publicity stunts. Because in these 3 days, you didn't really hear a word about Shakespeare, or any of Shakespeare's words, I should say. Basically, you heard Garrick's words about Shakespeare, and some of them were put to music, but it was really all about Garrick. Thomas Arne was part of the event. He was the conductor of the orchestra, but Dibdin was the principal composer of the Jubilee, and he set most of Garrick's other words to music. So we're going to hear the Warwickshire Lad, because Shakespeare was born in Warwickshire.
I Warwickshire lads i lasses, I what can't you and the passes. Up there on the way, rejoice and be glad. Up there on the way, rejoice and be glad. Oh, that was a Warwickshire lad. Warwickshire lad, oh, the lad, oh, that was a Warwickshire lad.
So really, the critics had the biggest problem with the self-promoting Garrick. Dibdin was just a musician caught in the middle. Now, he's especially remembered for his sea songs, many of them used by the British Navy. One of his most popular is Tom Bowling, written on the death of his eldest brother, Captain Thomas Dibdin, in 1789. And the tune from it forms part of Henry Wood's 1905 Fantasia on British Sea Songs, and it's customarily played on the last night of the proms. So unlike his more patriotic or comedic sea songs, this song emphasizes personal nobility. Death is not a tragedy, but an honorable transition.
Here she the hulk lies put on board, a darling of no more he'll hear the tempest howl, for death hath his form was of the beauty, his heart was kind and soft. Faithful below, Tom did his duty, and now he's gone.
That was our longest example, but you had to hear the notes at the end. They are just so impossibly beautiful. It would be wrong not to have you listen to them. All right, so I'm going to do this fast forward now. Catch and glee clubs were also going on in the 18th century. They were exclusively men's singing clubs, mostly male aristocrats, paid professionals, singing, eating, drinking. That's what they were about. Catches are rounds, and they're called that because they were pretty intricate. And as you started layering the voices, they would kind of catch and interplay in really wonderful ways. So we'll hear a little bit of a catch now.
Was you, sir, was you, sir, I tell you nothing new, sir, was you that kissed that pretty girl, was you, sir, you,
Was you, sir?
tis true, sir,
Was you, sir?
tis true, sir,
I
it
tell
looks so
you
very
nothing
good,
new,
sir,
sir.
I'm sure that kissed that pretty girl, was you, sir, you.
Closer, 'tis closer, closer, 'tis closer. I get so very closer. I'm sure I guess that pretty girl eyes are true. But you're gone.
And they would play games, drinking games, that if you made a mistake, then you had to take a shot. So you can imagine how this could devolve over the course of the evening. All right, then you had glee clubs. Glees were simply part songs for 3 or more male voices. I'm going to skip over that, though, because by the end of the 18th century, the catch was falling out of fashion. The glee began to be much more popular, partly a result of changing sensibilities and manners. There was a real yearning for the sublime, for the perfect, which really was part of the classical era, right, and the Enlightenment. There was an emergence of polite society, a philosophy of behavior that precluded anything vulgar, at least in public. The arts, just like society, were becoming more refined. When you think about it, this made perfect sense. Throughout the century, music was channeling righteousness and virtue, and served as an important part of creating a powerful shared sense of British national identity. People were aware of their duty to country and to the common good. So I just cannot finish this talk without a final nod to Samuel Johnson. Boswell quoted Johnson as having said, "Had I learned to fiddle, I should have done nothing else." So although he claimed to be mostly insensible to the power of music, he was very impressed by the technical skill it took for being a fiddler. So during his 1773 Scottish tour, he listened attentively to the fiddle playing. He requested an encore of this tune, "Let Ambition Fire Thy Mind," from the Judgment of Paris, a masque, you know what a masque is now, written in 1701 by John Eccles. This was the tune.
Let ambition fire the night, let ambition fire the night. Thou art born, thou art born, thou art born for men to pay. Thou art born, thou art born, thou art born for men to pay.
So that was the tune he requested to play over and over. So I want to thank you all so much for coming this afternoon, and I guess we do have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes.
Thank you for a fabulous talk, enlightening talk, on such a hot afternoon. And thank you all for coming today. Any questions?
Yes.
With the early singers, the Italian operas, when you had a soprano, was it always a woman? Were women allowed to sing on stage?
Oh, yes.
Like Shakespeare time when we went to
Oh yes, you had women. However, you did have the castrati, which was another phenomenon. In fact, the very first piece we heard by Bononcini, that happened to be a countertenor. That was a man singing, but that would have been a castrato singing that. Yeah, good question.
I've got a sort of general question. I have an impression that people in general just played instruments more then. Is that right? You know, you get people playing a pipe in a pub and fiddling away.
Yes.
Whereas now I think it seems more of an elite thing to play an instrument, except maybe a guitar.
Yeah, at the time, you started having at the end of the 18th century, you started having the very beginnings of pianos coming in, and it was the English action, actually, that really surpassed the Viennese action. The Viennese pianos, when they were first invented, the pianoforte, the soft loud, right? Because harpsichords, you can't, it's not touch sensitive. You can't play loudly or softly on a harpsichord because it plucks a string, all right? Different action with a piano, it hits it. However, so they were thrilled, the Italians invented this thing, they called it the soft loud because you could do both. But the Viennese piano still sounded an awful lot like a harpsichord, all right? In England, you started having the beginnings of the English action, and this took over. Actually, this is what we still use now. But they were smaller, you didn't have that many octaves to them, until Beethoven came along, and his music, the piano, it just had to expand. His music was too big for the piano, the smaller pianos. But yes, and you know, the different printed music, there was a whole business around that because this is where people could listen to music and entertain each other. Yeah. Yes.
So you said the action of early Italian pianos were different. How were they different, like more modern, where you're just striking one single string? Were they still more like harpsichords where you're plucking set of 3 per beat?
You still had the hammer action, but it was a thinner sound. You know, the English, you started getting cast iron in there. You started having, it was just much more sturdy. You know, when again, going back to Beethoven, because he influenced piano construction so much, I mean, he would kind of destroy the Viennese. They would fall apart. You know, it was the English ones that were able, and then they adapted it to his music. So it's really quite fascinating. I was lucky enough in grad school, I took a course at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and on piano construction. And we got to go into the back, into their collection and play all of these. And it's just really remarkable to see how it all evolved, working hand in hand with musicians too. Yes?
Yeah, when did composers like Handel finally free from the financial burden of their creations? You said earlier that it was bad from him, but nowadays they wouldn't be, you know, composer wouldn't be responsible for the production and all that. So at what time would they finally have patrons and?
Yeah, you know, with Handel, you know, when that almost went bankrupt financially, that first one was a flop, that was more the house that produced it, you know, the theater that produced it would be taking on the risk, all right? But then we still had a patronage system going on, right? So he had royal patronage, but he had many, many patrons, aristocrats, who were, you know, paying him to write things, not just the king. And the patronage system really went on until, you know, early 19th century.
So was he just paid for the original composition? He wouldn't have got any royalties?
No royalties, no pun intended there, yeah, but yeah, no royalties, that was it. Yeah. Okay, well again, thank you again for coming out in this heat.